Hello, lovely people. Yes, that is my cat hunting for something. So, back to basic series. Today we will be talking about a three-way, and today we will compare a basic two-way in factory locations versus a three-way in custom locations. I got some feedback that a lot of people quite enjoy this series. So while I'm talking, actually, we can have a look at the cat, what he's doing. And what people are saying that it's understandable, it's easy to digest, and some people just need a refresher and reminder about like car audio in general. So that's what I'm trying to do. So today we're going to tackle a three-way, and I'm going to try to show you with measurements and with everything. And again, I'm going to go easy on you. Everything is going to be explained in very simple terms. What would be the benefits of going three-way against a two-way? And at the same time, what would be the benefits of having custom locations rather than using like something like factory locations? So we will touch firstly on the mid-ranges. Tweeters and the A-pillars and in the sales, because apparently I was saying it wrong. I was saying it's sales, but it's a sale because it looks like a sale. So yeah, that's what you get for being a foreigner. Tweeters in sales were versus tweeters in A-pillars, they're extremely similar. As long as you have them on axis, because the only thing is just the distance and the distance to the glass. So we will have a look because I had this tweeter, which is the Illusion Audio. I had it in the sails aimed sideways. I had it in the A-pillar instead of these SB29. So I had it like literally in that location. And now I have them here. So we will be comparing this tweeter in three different locations. We're going to see how it measures and how it is. And then we're going to add the SB29 measurement as well. So we're going to compare how in the same location these two tweeters measure. Now, one thing bear in mind is that you see my ring for this tweeter is quite big. So when I had this tweeter in there, it had quite a lot of edge diffraction because this tweeter, the size is only like of the dome. So it had this lip all around it that sound was going to and kind of diffract it. It's called an edge diffraction, and it wasn't optimal for this tweeter, but I put it there just for testing purposes. But now for this SB29 is just perfect. So we'll be talking about the tweeters. Then I'm going to tell you about the mid-ranges, and what I want to show you about the mid-ranges is the benefits of having a mid-range in that location. So that specific location is the corner of the dash, and in that one as well. I put these tweeters in the very, very corner, as far in the corner as I possibly could. And the other thing is that these mid-ranges, you can see from here, they're slightly tilted, like maybe 20-30 degrees on axis a little, because you can see the corners, and that one is exactly the same. It is slightly tilted. So when I will show you the measurements, I will tell you what is the difference between a tilted one and when you have it flush with the dash and firing directly at the glass, because it does change some stuff. Now, the drivers in mind that are there, they're one audio widebands, the 3-inch widebands that can play all the way up to 20K. We're going to show that with measurements as well. If anybody's interested, I have a full review of those drivers. Now, unfortunately, I cannot compare the mids in dash with the mids in A-pillars just because I never had mids in A-pillars, but I might touch it on the analysis very briefly. And the other thing is the mid bass. So the mid bass, I have one audio 8-inch mid bass in the kicks over there, and I had the same drivers that I have in the door, which is the Illusion Audio C6s. I had them in that exactly the same location. So we will be comparing doors versus kicks for the same driver, and then how the response of the kicks changes when you swap for a different driver. It's going to be, again, three measurements comparing to this, and then we're going to see the benefit of having kicks versus the door. Another thing that I want to do, but I'm not sure how to do that, I would like to take impulse response measurements of the doors and the kicks and potentially to see if we can see some distortion differences or maybe like decay in a waterfall. So that's going to be a different project because I want to prove people, because I cannot show it on the video that kicks are better than doors, and I want to prove it to people. Now, I had one comment about the kicks that somebody said, how can a steel door be worse than plastic kick panel? So I don't know if people know that whenever you put mid bass in the doors, We don't mount it to the plastic panel. Let me show you on this side, it's going to be a bit easier. See this plastic panel? It's cut. There's nothing there. The mid base itself, it's mounted to the actual frame, to the actual body of the car. And I have aluminium rings bolted to that, and then the driver in there. So there's no plastic anywhere. Nothing is rattling. Whereas in the doors, you have the plastic panel that gets the direct energy from the mid base, unless you would cut out a hole and mount the driver kind of flush with the door card, but that's another can of worms. So yeah, now we're not going to look at the subwoofer responses now, because what I want to focus on the front end, because this beginner series is more focused on the higher frequencies for the mid bass, mid range, and the tweeter, like the treble and stuff. I do have a separate video about why do I need a front subwoofer. You can watch that one. But in ESQ, like, the whole system is as important. Every component of the system is very, very important. Like sub bass is important as well. However, for this one, we will be focusing mainly on the front end. Oh, so one other thing that I haven't mentioned, probably you noticed, but in the doors, when you have a speaker in the doors, it is mounted normally. That is, cone is facing towards you. Whereas in the kicks, my drivers are mounted inverse. That means that the actual cone is facing outwards, and what you get is the magnet facing towards you. Now, I did some experiments. I have a separate video about that when I tested inverted versus like normal, and the difference in response is mainly above like 500-600 hertz. So if you're playing a driver up to like 500 hertz, it doesn't really matter if the cone is facing you or the magnet, the motor, is facing you. It's exactly the same for our infinite baffle subs, where most of them are being mounted inverse, because there's no difference, basically, only for the very high frequencies. So when we're going to show you the measurements between these, keep that in mind, that the same driver, the Illusion Audio in the doors, was with coned facing you, and in the kicks, it was inversed. So this is just a little introduction of what we're going to cover. And now let's jump into the laptop and let's see the measurements. So as you can see, I do have quite a lot of measurements, and I think we're going to start with the tweeters because it's the easiest one. So first, what I'm going to show you is the Illusion Audio tweeters in the sales, and they're off axis, and I had them literally in factory locations, just a little bit behind the grill, and the tweeters were basically aimed towards each other. And for this, we can clearly see that we have, it looks like a hump here, but in reality, this is a response that is rolling off above 6K and going down. So we have a roll off, and then after like 14K, there's literally nothing. And this is very typical for tweeters that are aimed off axis. Now, you could try to fix it by boosting this very top end to have the extension at least up to like 16K. But the problem is that whenever you have a situation like this, or you have the tweeters in A pillars and you're boosting the very, very top end, that extra energy, because it is extra energy, is going towards your passenger and potentially towards the passenger window, and it's reflecting back, and that's why you have the smearing of the center image, because the top end that you have all the upper harmonics. So the bass notes, whereas going to be instrument or voices, could be in the mid-range, but the tweet is going to give you all the upper harmonics that make the sound feel natural and normal. And when you have those upper harmonics literally bouncing back and forth from the windshield, from the passenger side, then you have all the smearing and you don't have a proper normal focused center image. Now, let's have a look what happens when you have exactly the same location, and the only difference is that instead of tweeter firing to the side, you fire the tweeter forwards, like towards you on axis, and you're gonna have this. So yes, the level is not the same because probably the crossover points are a bit different. I don't really remember what I used on this measurement, but the main trend that you can see is that when you aim a tweeter on axis, you have all of this top end. Let me just zoom in just a little bit, just like that. So yeah, UMIC is measuring up to 20K. That's why after 20K, it's a massive drop. But the main thing you notice is that you have all this extra energy in the very, very top end, and you have it up to 16K. and then you could potentially give it a little 2-3 dB boost in the very, very top end, and you would have it all the way up to 20K. So aiming your tweeter on axis is giving you very, very good results. Now let me remove this one, and the next measurement is the same tweeter as I showed you in the very beginning in the A pillar. So this is a measurement taken with probably like 1000 hertz crossover points. So again, it's not really a comparison between the slopes itself, but you can see, like, if we take the measurement from 5K, if I would apply a higher crossover, this would go into the slope. But the main thing you can see here that it's very, very similar. There's not a big difference between these responses. Now, this one, if you're gonna have a look at it as it is like this, it is linear as well, and something happening here about 15K. Now, could this be due to the edge diffraction that I was describing? Maybe, potentially, I'm not sure, but the response is very, very nice. You can see it's much, much more linear compared to off-axis. And if you would have a tweeter in an A-pillar off-axis, you would have a similar roll-off. This is in the pillar, and this is my current SB29 in the pillar. And you can see it has the same thing. So this, maybe because it affects both tweeters, it could be something else. It could be maybe a reflection from the actual pillar itself, because it's very high in frequency, so the distance has to be very, very close. But very, very similar response apart from the slope, because again, as I mentioned, this crossover point was probably like 1000 hertz, but the response is very similar. So if we compare the SB29 in pillars and the Illusion Audio in sails aimed on axis, we have a very similar response. Now, yes, SB29 plays much lower because you can cross it much lower. This has to be crossed a bit higher, but the response is very, very similar. And if we're gonna have a look at the response of SB29, it's totally flat. Like, this is with no EQ. I'm gonna do 20 to 20 just to have a look at it better. There's no EQ. If I'm gonna show you in the EQ window, let's go with this, open EQ, let's do bass limited. I don't remember the frequency to 24 dB. Let's drop it to 53, so 2.5. There we go. So this tweeter, you can see it's acoustical 2.5K response, just like that, and it literally doesn't need EQ. It's like plus minus 1 dB or so. This slope needs EQing a little bit just to remove it a little bit and maybe boost the very, very top end. But this response is super nice with no EQ. You could play it with zero EQ. It plays all the way up to like 14.5K with no issues whatsoever. So when you compare factory location with custom A pillar, obviously it's a different driver, but the difference is huge. And this is the main benefit. When you experiment a lot, I didn't really experiment with these pillars, with aiming and anything. I just did it from the top of my head, but I tried to aim it on axis. But you can see even with that, you have much, much better results than having a tweeter in a factory location. And we're going to have a look at the right side, which is the driver side for me. You can see this in the driver side, it rolls off very, very early, about like 6K or so. It just goes down because it's off axis. And it's quite a lot of off axis, like maybe 45, 50, 60 degrees off axis. And you literally have no top end. If you would want to have any top end like this, you would need to cut 10 decibels with EQ, all of this mountain. But yeah, if you aim it on axis, you have this, which is like you have all of this, you get more than 10 decibels of extra energy at the very top end. Yes, there's a little dip here, but it's fine. You can boost it a little bit. So you can see the factory versus aiming on axis is a massive, massive difference. Now, if we have a look at the sails versus pillar, again, pillar, it's nonsense here because it's a very, very low crossover, but this pillar has a bit more problems. You can see like a drop over here at the higher frequencies, and SB29 has very similar problems in the pillar. You can see this drop off. So it could be a reflection from the side window, or it could be a reflection from the actual pillar itself, but it's not as bad. So yes, Illusion Audio in the sails on axis versus SB29. SB29 plays much lower. But if we compare both SB29s, you can see the slope is almost identical, all the way up to here, almost identical, and then a little discrepancy here. Factory locations versus custom A pillars. There's a huge, massive difference. Now, before we talk about mid-ranges, let's have a look at the mid-bass. So we have Illusion Audio in the doors, which was previously showed to you and measured, where we have a massive hole here, we have a cancellation here, and we have a roll-off. So this is in the left passenger side door. If I would have exactly the same driver, shift it into the kicks as I showed you, the response is like this. So it is a huge difference, especially at higher frequencies. We're losing all the high frequency content basically just because the driver is inverted and is hidden under the dash. So you're not going to have a lot of high frequency stuff. But if you have a look at the lower frequencies, what's happening here, what we had, you can see all of these peaks and dips and everything, which was plus minus 5 decibels, like plus 5 here, minus 5 here, and that and that. In the kicks, it's smooth. It's not perfect, but it's very smooth. Because in my system, I want my mid bass to cover up to like 200 hertz or so, which is up to here. So if you imagine like this range, there's no cancellations, there's no nothing, and with EQ work, it's just very little, maybe like 2-3 dB here and there, and everything is perfect. So this is the main benefit of having a driver, of taking away driver from the doors and put it in the kicks. Now the downside is that we have this massive hole at 330, and basically this is a cabin cancellation, same like we had in the right side, which is this one, the 150 hertz cancellation, exactly the same cancellation we have on the passenger side from the kicks. However, that cancellation is in quite high frequency, like 300 hertz. So if you have a mid-range that can cover down to like 250 or so down to here, this doesn't really matter. It is there, but it doesn't affect much because the main region where the mid bass is playing is over here, and you can see, as I mentioned, the response is much nicer than from the doors. Now what happens if we would replace this Illusion Audio driver with a one audio that I have, and we have this? You can see the bottom end, it doesn't change at all. Yeah, like plus minus 1 dB, it doesn't really matter. The biggest difference is in the higher frequencies. If I'm gonna do this, we can see that the one audio plays high frequencies much more, even all the way up to like 16K. Now, yes, it is inverted, so it's not as quality sound as you would have if you would have it on axis cone facing towards you, but we still have that content, we still have that music playing. Now, obviously, this content is not really beneficial for us, like above 350, because we're gonna cross it. It's not a two-way system, it's gonna be a three-way system. But the main benefit, again, is this region, where the response has no acoustical problems at all, and it can play with no cancellations and nothing. So that's the left side, which is the passenger side. On the right side, if you remember, this is the doors, Illusion Audio in the doors, and we had this cancellation, massive one, a little bit scoop out here and the roll off here, but you can see that the response is all jaggedy riggedy and it's not nice. When we put exactly the same driver in the kicks, we have this, and again we're losing all the top end, so like the mid-range frequencies, which in a three-way were not intended to play it anyway. However, if you look at this cancellation, it's not there. It's like we're gaining is 5 dB scale, 5, 10, 15 decibels of this cancellation, and the response is much nicer. Yes, we have this mountain, which perfectly, almost perfectly corresponds to the target curve that I need this driver to play. And we do have a little bit more energy here in this area above 200 compared to the left side. So the left one was this. You can see the left one rolls off much steeper, and the right side has much more energy here, and it just allows for a slightly higher target. And you can see this difference now is plus minus 3 dB or so. Yes, it does roll off here, it does here, but this cancellation is not as pronounced, and at 150 we have nothing. This is not really a cancellation. You can boost it and it does response, so it's much nicer. And the one audio, the difference is the top end, again, because one audio, they can play as full range drivers even inverted. So basically, when I swap the drivers and the location, I got basically from this, so from the green one to the orange one, doors versus kicks. The main region that where the kicks are playing is like this region between what, 60 and 200. And you can see where we had the hole before, now we don't. Now it's a much nicer response. So basically this is the main benefit of changing the driver location in order to get a better response. You can see for the bass itself, if we take frequencies below like 200, there's literally no difference between these two drivers, the Illusion Audio and One Audio. But the biggest difference between the drivers is going to be at the very top end. And I could add Alpine Status drivers that I had before, and you would see that the response is exactly the same. Now, bear in mind, this response is with no crossovers. If you would apply crossover, for example, to the One Audio, you would have this, which is crossed at 65 Hertz at 24 dB slope, which is the recommendation for these One Audio drivers. And yes, you lose a little bit of bottom end, but when you have a front subwoofer, this is being covered and the response is much nicer. So again, going custom and changing driver locations is one benefit when you have a much nicer frequency response. The second benefit is the actual sound or feel of the bass. And as I mentioned, I'm going to try to do another video to prove that solid mounting in the kicks, especially this region, sounds much nicer and better compared to the doors. Now let's talk about the mid-ranges. This is my left and this is the right mid-range. So these mid-ranges are One Audio WB3.E, which is the wide bands. As I mentioned, I did review them. And this is a typical response of a mid-range in that specific location. So let's take one, I don't know, let's take the left one, the passenger side. I'm going to try to explain what we see in here because for the dash mounted mids, most of them are going to behave in the same way. What you have, the response is not very linear. Now, why? What we're seeing here is we're seeing this hump in the lower mid-range, then we have the response rolling down into a little valley, and then it kind of picks up. So for example, this top end above like 3K will depend on the driver itself. If the driver is a mid-range, that response is going to be much more flatter, or it will gonna go down. If the driver is a wideband, such as this one, then you're gonna have a rising or a flat frequency response. So as I mentioned, this driver can play all the way up to 20K. Well, up to 18.5K, but basically it plays all the way because we can hear up to 16, which is something here. And this is even with the mid-range firing up the glass. If you would have same driver in A-pillars, you would see kind of a similar picture. The response would be much more linear. However, it would have much more peaks and dips all over the place because of the reflections that are going to happen between the dash, the side window, and the windshield. But in this dash mounted mid-range response, the only cancellation that you have is this one, which is at 1.8K. At the right side, it's something similar, but it's not that visible. You can argue that it's like 1.5K or this one. So if you have a driver that is flush mounted, there we go, I managed to find a different response. I do believe those were 5-inch Satori drivers that were flush mounted to the dash and aimed directly into the windshield up. And you can see this is the same location, just different drivers. So you have different low end extension, different roll off. You can see it rolls off, but you have this. So 1.3K, this is a massive cancellation. Another one here, another one here. If I'm going to remove this one, you can see 1, 2, 3. So this is just a reflection from the windshield. When you aim the driver towards you, like I did in my car, then you have that those cancellations kind of disappear. Not really disappear, but you're trying to minimize them. The more you aim, the more you minimize these cancellations to the point where this is just a little dip. It's not really a cancellation. And again, I do have a full video about aiming the mid-range speakers, and I show what is the difference between aimed and flush mounted drivers. So you can have a look at this. But this is very typical for every mid-range that is aimed towards the glass. You will have bigger or smaller cancellation. I want to say like between 1 and 2K. This cancellation frequency will depend on the distance to the glass. So that's why everybody always says mount the drivers as close to the glass as possible. Then you would have a shorter distance, and this cancellation is going to go to the higher frequencies. So if you have that cancellation like I do at about 1.5K for the right side, and for the left side is more like 1.8K. This is almost in the crossover region because my left tweeter, you can see, it goes like that, and then this goes like this, and this is in the crossover region. So it's not really affecting much. Obviously, if you would have something like this, where I had the old one and we had this hole here, and then I would have a tweeter, for example, the Illusion Audio in the sales, which doesn't really play low, you can see how these cancellations from the windshield go directly into the actual mid-range response, and they will affect how everything sounds. So when you're mounting mid-ranges in the dash, you want them to be as close to the glass as possible and kind of tilted towards you as much as you can, so that you would have a much nicer response with less cancellations. Now, the other thing that you probably notice, as I mentioned, we have this hump of frequencies compared to the rest. And everybody says that when you have dash mounted mids, that you have a response like here, and then it rolls off. No, really, the actual response of the mid-range is this level. This is how it would play, but all this hump below 1K is the natural acoustical boost that you have due to the location. Since the driver is in the very corners of the dash, you have the effect as if you would be cupping your mouth and shouting, or you have that megaphone effect, which we can call it like horn loaded, which might be incorrect because horn loads the actual cone, but this is just the as a waveguide, you can say. The windshield, the dash, and the pillar acts as like a cone shape, and that's why you have this reinforcement of these frequencies. And this is literally free energy. So when you have this level and then you need to potentially cut it down, you're not really cutting down the actual level of the speaker, you're cutting down the gain that you get from the natural acoustical boost. And this is why it's very beneficial to mount mid-range in the corners of the dash, because when you have this extra energy here, you have that extra energy in the crossover region as well. Let me show you the mid-range right with the crossover. So this is with the crossover applied. This is without the crossover. This is with crossover. So with the crossover applied at 220 hertz, we still have a lot of energy to integrate the mid-ranges with the mid-bass, especially when you have them in the kicks. So this is with a crossover, and this is my right mid bass. I think it's gonna be more useful to show you the left one. There we go. I just adjusted a little bit the level to bring it down just to match it and look nicer. So this is the mid bass with one of the crossovers, which is the high pass filter applied. There's no low pass filter on it. And this, the green one, is the response of the mid range with a high pass as well. And you can see that they meet somewhere here about 220 to something, and the only thing that you need to do is to cut this top end with a low pass for the mid bass, and they meet perfectly nice. Now, some people say that you need a large mid-range driver to play low to reach the mid bass in the kicks. Sometimes it is definitely the case, but when you have the mid-ranges in the corners of the dash and you have this acoustical boost, you have a little bit more energy at the bottom end compared if you would have it in the pillars. If you would have the same mid-range driver in the pillar, this line would be probably somewhere here, and you would have much less energy in here to cover this gap between the mid-bass. So with the dash mount and mid-ranges, you can get away with having a slightly smaller driver just because you have this boost. Now, yes, you can see this massive mountain that you will need to cut down. And I love that a few days ago I showed my Surface laptop that I bought, and I showed a EQ curve for the mid-ranges. There we go, that's the picture, and it looks something like this. And somebody commented, "Oh, I love your curve." So yes, I did remove, you can see it's like probably 10 decibels cut. I did it from memory because I know that I need this cut right here at about 660, about 600 hertz, 10 dB just to bring this peak all the way down and to have it more flat. So even if this looks a bit silly, it is for a reason, because I need to cut this. And as I mentioned, the actual level of the tweeter is somewhere here, where you have this top end, and this is the extra acoustical boost that you can cut, and you're not going to lose the output of the driver, because the main output is this level. So yes, this might need boosting a little bit, but it meets the tweeter perfectly fine. Now, one thing that I would like to explain a bit more is this crossover between the mid bass and the mid range. This is a very similar situation what you have in BMWs. So in BMWs, you usually have an 8-inch mid bass driver under the seat and a 4-inch driver in the door cards. However, with BMWs, the problem is that from under the seats, the mid bass doesn't play as high as this mid bass from the kicks. So this mid bass from the kicks, you can see up to 200. It's very nice. Whereas in BMWs, you will have them playing up to 150, and then it drops down like this. And then with the mid-ranges in BMWs, since they are mounted in the door cards, they don't have this extra boost. And even if it is like a 4-inch driver, a little bit bigger than this, it doesn't really play that low. It's not going to play down to 150 to cross into the mid bass with very nice slopes. So with BMWs, in a lot of cases, what's going to happen that there's going to be a gap between the mid bass and the mid-range in the crossover region. And a lot of people think that, oh, it's a phase issue, just swap the phase for the tweeter and then they're gonna sum. They're not gonna sum because it is an acoustical problem where the mid-bass doesn't play as high and the mid-range doesn't play as low. It's a very similar situation where we had in our two-way, where we had that the mid-bass doesn't play as high to the tweeter and the tweeter doesn't play as low to reach the mid-bass. So in some BMWs, it is the case. But in my system, it is kind of designed in the way that everything reaches. Even with a 3-inch driver, I can reach the mid bass playing up to 250. And again, if we're going to compare very quickly the mid-range, how the mid-range covers the doors. So left side mid-range and left side doors. So you can see where we had these massive issues on the passenger side. Let me just bring it down for you to better to see, just like that. So with the mid bass in the doors, we had, as I mentioned before, this hole in the very, very mid-range region, and then we have a roll off. Whereas the actual mid-range driver covers everything. It covers this one. Yes, we need to pull it down. Rather than boosting 15 decibels, we need to cut like 7-8 decibels, and then we're covering the mid-range perfectly. And where the mid-bass rolls off and doesn't really reach the tweeter, this one plays all the way and you can cross it wherever potentially you want, and it's gonna cover this gap. So this is the benefit of having the mid-range. So this is the left side and this is the right side. So again, if you remember, we had this kind of scoop out in the very mid-range region, and then it rolls off. So the mid-range exactly covers this scoop out perfectly. And then you have that top end extension with integration to the tweeter. Now, some people say, can you try to cover this cancellation that you have in a door with a mid-range? No, not really. The mid-range is not going to play that low. Even the one that I had here, which is a 5-inch, it does cover this frequency. You can see it plays down to 100. However, playing a driver down to 100 from the dash is going to introduce a lot of rattles. There's literally too much energy and it's not going to feel as nice and as good. So with RTA, you kind of can do it, but really you shouldn't. The only proper way to get rid of this is just to move the driver. But adding a wideband instead of a tweeter like we had this, you can see the mid-range offers much more energy. Let me just remove the mid-range. Yeah, so you can see the mid-bass. This is a two-way. As you remember, I showed you in the previous video. Mid-bass in the door, tweeter, gap, it's not going to reach it. If you add a mid-range, it covers that gap. And even if you use the tweeter, you're going to have a much, much nicer response. So mid-range always improves the sound. Now, yes, it does complicate the tuning because you have an extra driver, you need more channels and blah, 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 that kind of stuff. But it always a better solution than a tweeter. So in a two-way system, as I said, that it's not as good. Now, a wideband driver such as this plus the doors make a very good combination. So you can cross this system at about 300-400 hertz, much higher than that, and the wideband is going to play much lower. So if you have an option instead of a tweeter to put a wideband driver, even a smaller one like a 2-inch wideband, always do that so that you would cover this range where you have a suck out in most cars in the mid-range area. If your mid-range can play down to 350, 300 hertz, that's going to be covered, and that's going to sound much nicer than having a hole from the mid-bass driver. Now, the problem is that you don't see kits, two-way kits sold with a wideband driver. All kits are being sold 6.5 woofer and a small tweeter. In order to have this system where you have a wideband with a woofer, you need to select your drivers very carefully. And this driver that I have, which is the One Audio wideband, is a highly recommended driver and it's going to work in most systems as long as you have space. So yeah, it's been a long video. I do really appreciate you listening to me ramble all this 40 minutes or so. But this is pretty much covers the benefits of a three-way and a mid-range and different locations compared to the doors, like that, where you kind of remove this cancellation from the equation. Yeah, this is what we do. This is why we do custom A-pillars. This is why we do custom dashes. This is why we do kicks instead of the doors. It's all for better sound. So again, thank you for sticking with me till the end. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.